Aloha, welcome everyone to the Hawaii Book and Music Festival. I'm Robert Perkinson, coordinator of UH's Better Tomorrow Speaker Series, and I am the moderator today. Today we're going to be talking about the epic events that we've all been living through, the greatest global pandemic in a century. We're deep into it now. We're in late October. Hawaii is just now exiting the worst wave of infection, the Delta wave that came, this worst wave came quite late to Hawaii. We have some 80,000 confirmed cases, surely more, of COVID-19. We're closing in on 900 deaths. We hope not many more of those. Still, these are 900 deaths is no small number if we would have imagined what we expected early in this process, and that still puts Hawaii better off than any other state in per capita terms, amazingly. On the front lines of this, even before the fighting started, has been Jonathan Dworkin, our guest today. He's an infectious disease specialist affiliated with Queens. He's now on the Big Island. And although he's been treating patients at a frantic pace all through this pandemic, he emerged as an especially lucid and urgent voice in public health in media early in the pandemic and had really quite significant influence on policy. And somehow out of the whirlwind, he has also managed to write an insightful and important book that is being published just now. And we'll put the image of it on screen. It is titled The Plague Doctors: How Hawaii Battled the Pandemic. And it is the first and the best attempt to write Hawaii's history of COVID-19 while that history is still unfolding. And in the process, it has a lot to say about medicine, misinformation, healthcare policy, political courage, how festering inequalities and political dysfunctions put us all at risk, and what we might be able to do about it. So welcome, Jonathan. Thank you so much for your work, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your generous encomium, which is on the back cover of the book.
You're welcome. It's nice to see you again. I've now spent a fair bit of time with you over these last months, and I have only met you in 2 dimensions, I believe.
Yeah.
And here we meet again. You know, this pandemic has gone on for so long. It is difficult in some ways for us to remember what it was like when we were first starting to get alarming news, and maybe our first steps were to try to stock up on some hand sanitizer at Long's. But you as an infectious disease specialist, you knew that this was coming for you. So when did you first hear about COVID-19?
Like everyone else, I first became aware of it through news media reports around New Year's, early January. And when you're an infectious disease doctor, you're constantly hearing of new infections emerging, and most of them remain local phenomena and don't, drop in the way that it did, obviously. So I can't say that my first reaction was alarm. It wasn't. My first reaction was, oh, here's another new thing, and I was interested in it. I was a medical student when SARS-1 emerged. I had just completed an infectious disease fellowship with MERS, which was the other big coronavirus emerged. And I remember doing a grand rounds at Queens Punch Bowl on emerging infections in the wake of the MERS epidemic. I was not surprised to see a new coronavirus emerge, but the previous 2 did not become nearly as disruptive as this one did. So I was not alarmed initially. I became alarmed when it became obvious that it was leaking beyond the borders of China. And when we began to see the really heavy-handed response in Wuhan that the epidemic necessitated. And at that point, a lot of people will remember the sort of official talking points that were being echoed by a lot of public health authorities, both in China and in the West, were to try to reassure people. What was happening on the ground was no longer reassuring. And I think that's when my antenna kind of went up. And I began paying very close attention to cases as they went beyond China's borders. And I tried to keep myself honest by defining in advance what I would consider truly alarming. And the criteria I came up for myself would be, non-China cases are growing logarithmically over a fairly short period of time, a week or 2. And I actually began charting on my computer cases as they spread beyond China. I was looking at, data being reported by countries like Singapore and Japan and Thailand, places like that. And what you saw through January was sort of a smattering of cases, not a whole lot, but an inability of those countries to stamp it out completely. So there'd be a case here, a case there, there'd be a few days of quiet, and then there'd be a few more cases. And this was despite very effective public health systems in neighboring countries. Japan and Singapore are not slouches when it comes to public health. The fact that they couldn't beat it down and stamp it out was alarming to me. And then in late February, you saw a real explosion of cases in Korea, Italy, and Iran in very rapid sequence. And that's when it became obvious to me that we were dealing with a pandemic. I had my suspicions before then, but that's when all illusions were barred.
So was it clear from those first outbreaks that couldn't be contained? Was it, the two characteristics that set SARS, this particular virus, up apart from the other coronaviruses, MERS and SARS that you talked about, at least as I think I understand it, like lower fatality rate, but much greater infectiousness.
That's right. That's correct. And asymptomatic transmission, which is, I think, what really got us. And it wasn't entirely clear early on. I mean, at first, the Chinese government did not even acknowledge that human-to-human transmission was happening, but it was obvious that it was happening. And then the question was, okay, how contagious is it? And is there transmission that happens before people become symptomatic, or can people actually go the whole course of an infection asymptomatic and transmit? And the answer to those questions was yes. And that's what makes, symptom-based screening, which was sort of a mainstay of controlling epidemics, emerging epidemics, ineffective in this case. So you need to get much more aggressive with your infection control measures if you can't rely on symptoms to catch cases. And I think that's why a lot of the early border control stuff failed. You saw very aggressive contact tracing efforts in places like Singapore and Japan that kept numbers in check, but couldn't eliminate transmission chains altogether. And for me, that was kind of definitive. The China data was interesting because they obviously had a massive outbreak going on in Wuhan, and that was real, but it was a little hard to make sense of what their reporting was because there were some things they were very forthcoming about and some things they were not. And I thought it would be wiser to focus on the surrounding countries in order to get my own head straight in terms of what was going on.
So what were the sort of pathogens that most dominated your practice before coronaviruses?
Yeah, well, one of the first things you notice, so when I moved to Hawaii, I did my residency training at Queens, at the University of Hawai'i. And most of that was at Queens Punch Bowl. So when you're walking down the hallway in Queens Punch Bowl, there's a portrait of Queen Emma up on the wall. And she kind of looks at you and it's a friendly look, but it's also a, hey, are you going to help us or not kind of look. I always found myself very humbled by that portrait and by the history of that institution in particular. And I began reading about it a little bit more. And I realized that the whole Queens health system was built in response to the smallpox epidemic in the 1850s. And when you read the history of epidemic disease in these islands and what happened to the native population, it's a massive historical tragedy and injustice. And that was, in my mind, the backdrop for everything that happened with COVID-19. I was walking into a hospital that was built by the Queen of Hawaii in response to a deadly epidemic. And I was living through a deadly epidemic. And I thought, boy, I got to step up. I got to do my job here. It's on me. Are we going to be in a situation where history repeats itself? Or are we going to be in a situation where we can give this a better ending? There wasn't one particular pre-COVID infection that I was fascinated by. I like the variety of the work. A lot of the more pedestrian stuff that was happening in Honolulu prior to the pandemic is exactly the kind of stuff that you would find in any big city in America. I had a lot of patients who were suffering from various forms of urban poverty, coming in with infected wounds or pneumonias, things of that kind. And then I had patients who were elderly or frail or immunocompromised, who had cancers, who were getting treated and they were immunosuppressed from their cancer therapies. Those were the kinds of cases I had and continued to have all through the pandemic. That stuff didn't stop happening just because we had a pandemic.
Of course. how much did those patients, I mean, you mentioned that there was this kind of neglect, but how much how much consequence do you think that had in terms of quality of care for people who weren't infected with COVID during this period?
I think it mounted over time, you know. So you can do things like stop elective surgeries and close the the chemotherapy infusion center for a week or two and get away with it. But when you have months of disruption, you start to
that starts to affect outcomes.
It starts to affect outcomes. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Now that said, there was an argument made at the beginning, which I think was disingenuous, that we should just focus on those outcomes and not try to control the virus at all. And that would have been completely wrong, because this was a virus that had the capacity to completely overwhelm the healthcare system. And the sort of let it rip approach, which was advocated for by some at the beginning, would have also disrupted care for everybody else. It would have just led to a larger mortality event from COVID. So we had to be able to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. We had to be able to respond to the pandemic aggressively and control the spread, but also maintain some level of functioning for all of our other patients.
I think it's instructive that you mentioned the history of Queens in response to the smallpox epidemic, because of course, everyone in this COVID-19 outbreak has received these sort of thumbnail histories of pandemics in world history that kind of start with the Black Death and then feature the Great Influenza in World War I. But perhaps the greatest mass death involved indigenous peoples in the Americas, and and then in the Pacific, as European colonizers arrived and brought pathogens with them, and the death toll is in the tens of millions at least of people who died in wave after wave after wave of population suppressing pandemics all through the Hawaiian Islands and all through North and South America too. And that's what's so tragic, is that we have seen some repetition of history in that, lo and behold, the populations that have been hit hardest by COVID have been those, most historically, intergenerationally decimated by infectious disease, and those most economically disadvantaged. Did you see health disparities affecting COVID outcomes and shaping it from the very beginning, or did it take some time for that to become clear?
Pretty quickly. The first wave of cases we had in Hawaii was mostly travel related. So that population was a mixed population of people who were traveling. I saw a lot of cases that were related to Vegas at the very beginning. I still see cases that are related to Vegas, by the way. So that's
a whole epidemiology paper right there.
That's right. There's a whole epidemiology paper there. But especially that second wave in the summer was one that was skewed very heavily towards Pacific Island population, and what we saw was it got into crowded intergenerational housing, and it just ripped through, right? And this is not unique to Hawaii. We saw it rip through crowded intergenerational housing all over the world. So we knew that was coming. And one of my frustrations, which I describe in the book, is knowing that was likely to happen. My colleague David DeRoff brought it up in the very first meeting we had together with the state task force on COVID response. So, we were aware of this, and then it happened, and we seemed to be helpless to stop it from happening.
I interviewed you about this in April, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. We were beside ourselves over this, and I'm not enough of a sociologist to understand all of it, but it seemed to have a talent for preying on the vulnerable. And particularly, the virus doesn't care. The virus is just going to get where it can get. But, people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged are more likely to be in crowded intergenerational housing. And they're less likely to be able to work.
Yeah, right? Or less likely to be able to work on Zoom.
That's right. That's right. And we saw something similar in New York, where it really impacted immigrant communities in Queens, in New York. The hospital that I did my infectious disease rotation in as a fourth-year medical student was Elmhurst Hospital. And that's a very diverse urban hospital in Queens, New York. I think it's one of the most diverse square miles in America.
And one of the hospitals that kind of famously got hit really hard, right? By that,
they got crushed.
Initial wave. Yeah.
They got crushed by the initial wave. Yeah. So we had our own little version of that in some of the more urban parts of Honolulu, and Queens bore the brunt of it.
So when it came to kind of seeking to, or kind of maybe being compelled to weigh in on policy questions in addition to patient care questions. I presume that started happening first at the hospital level or at the health systems level. Like, so were you, how did Queens do in your estimation compared to other major healthcare providers in kind of preparing and setting in place protocols in the winter in preparation for the first wave? And how much were you involved in kind of setting those policies
I was
without getting you in trouble?
I was a big nudnik at that time, I remember. But I think, like any other collection of humans, we had a variety of opinions on A, how serious it would be, on B, what the appropriate response should be, and also on the pace of the response. Once I decided in my mind, sometime in mid-February, that this was coming at us fast and it was coming at us hard, I kind of lost my filter internally and began really pushing very aggressively for us to stand up systems, in particular testing and things like that. Even if the people that had to stand those systems up didn't feel ready to administratively. That said, I think we got on the same page very quickly, and I have to credit the Queen's leadership for seeing the big picture there. They set in motion processes that allowed everyone's voices to be heard and the best ideas to emerge. And pretty quickly, certainly by I'd say the first wave or the middle of the first wave, we were kind of firing on all cylinders. We had testing up and running. We had a system in place for PPE use and PPE recycling. We were beginning to standardize our approach to supportive care and to treatment. We were beginning to standardize our approach to clinical trials. We were beginning to standardize our approach to infection control. Not everybody agreed with everything, but I think, and not only that, when we began arguing a little bit with the state on things like discharge, I didn't feel comfortable during that first wave with some of the discharging because people were going back into those crowded intergenerational houses. Well, Queen's administration stepped up there too and began trying to find hotel rooms for people. So
yeah, okay. Well, this gets us into talking about the policy in the state and the city more generally, because as we have learned in a pandemic, as important as healthcare providers and hospitals are, they may not be the most important tools to contain a public health crisis of this magnitude. And you also really need testing and isolation and contact tracing. There were a lot of factors nationally that led to a sluggish start in testing. But our sluggishness in hiring personnel to handle contact tracing maybe falls more on us. As you know, I was quite dismayed that we didn't do a better job of isolating people, even though we had an island full of empty hotels. That gave us a lot more capacity to isolate than, besides Vegas, almost any other city in the country. Like, we really had the capacity to do a lot of isolating to try to contain the pandemic. When did you first start getting pulled away from patient beds and into political offices, at least maybe virtually, though that was?
I had colleagues who were working with HYEMA, and I described this in the book, who asked me to comment.
This is Hawaii's emergency management agency out of the, from state government, just to make clear.
Yeah, the Hawaii, right, exactly, the Hawaii branch of FEMA. And I was asked to actually weigh in on some of the discussions. And when I began to look into disease transmission and the impact it would have on healthcare, it became obvious very quickly that if we didn't do something to interrupt transmission, we could do as well as we wanted to do in the hospital, but we were going to get overwhelmed. And we certainly weren't going to do as well in the hospital in April of 2020 as we were going to be able to do in October of 2021. We all knew that. We all knew we would only get better with time. So could we interrupt transmission enough to buy ourselves some time to be better at this? And that was sort of the rubric that began to form in my mind around that time. And there were a couple of specific experiences related to that. There were academic centers on the mainland that were doing modeling of the epidemic, and you could go online and you could play with some of these calculators, which I did, and you could change, for example, the lethality of the disease. You could make the disease more or less deadly, or you could change things like transmission dynamics. And what I noticed when I did that was if you change transmission dynamics, you had a much bigger effect on the mortality event than if you change the lethality of the disease, interestingly. And it's because of the nature of exponential growth. These epidemics are mathematical phenomena and they grow exponentially. So when you interrupt transmission, you're interrupting exponential growth. And once I realized that, I began looking around at our system and I thought, well, we can do as well as we want in the hospital. I can improve mortality 10% or 20% by doing A, B, and C in the hospital. That's not going to mean anything if we have out of control transmission in the city. So what are we doing to control transmission in the city? And because I had been invited to comment on this for HAIMA, I began looking around at HAIMA and saying, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And that became increasingly frustrating very quickly because what I encountered was essentially a mirror image of the mindset that had played out on the mainland, which was, this is a respiratory virus. We really can't do anything about it. It's going to run its course. We don't want to kill the economy. Let's just prepare to surf the wave as best we can. We'll bring in some extra ventilators, that kind of thing. And it was, I thought, very wrong-headed. So I began focusing like a laser beam on transmission interruption strategies. And in doing so, I bumped into and befriended some of the epidemiology folks. And I was relieved. One of my first conversations with Tim Brown was around this set of questions. And he had a much more sophisticated understanding of the epidemic modeling than I did. But I was relieved to find that my conclusions from that were pretty closely in alignment with his, and that we needed to do what we could to interrupt transmission. So those guys became my kind of crew, and along with a few other clinical docs who saw it the same way. And we began focusing on transmission interruption as part of the disease response, even though that was not strictly part of my job as a clinical ID person.
We're starting to close in on the end of the hour. So I want to make sure that we return to kind of clinical practice in the present. There were a lot of basic predictions about the virus, the case fatality rate and the scale of deaths and infections that thoughtful observers and modelers were making early on proved to be tragically accurate. One thing I did not expect was that Hawaii would get hit with its most severe wave of infection and death many months after incredibly effective vaccines were made available and after the state had done pretty well compared to some other places in getting its population vaccinated. Your book was finished, maybe most of it before the Delta wave struck, is that right?
That's right, and I had to go back and write an afterword to get us up to date through August and September, which was not a joy.
So how did it or didn't it kind of upend some of your thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic as a whole?
Well, before Delta hit, we had vaccinated close to 60% of the state, and the truth is that was enough to crutch the previous waves of COVID that had come through. So the number of people you need to vaccinate and has to do with how contagious the virus is. But the enemy has a vote, and the virus mutated. And this strain is far more contagious. This is one of the most contagious viruses in the world. It's more contagious than smallpox. So 60% is not going to cut it. And what we saw was an increase in all infections, including in breakthrough infections in people who were vaccinated. But mostly what we saw was unvaccinated. The vast majority of cases were unvaccinated, and the vast majority of hospitalizations were unvaccinated. So, the Delta
imagine if this Delta wave had hit with 0% vaccination.
Well, we don't have to imagine, because that's what happened in India, and they experienced, we estimate several million deaths. It was a complete disaster. So, at least we didn't have that. But it was still a wave that was deadlier than any of our previous waves. And rounding in the hospital was a surreal experience at this time. I mean, for me, it was the most demoralizing wave of any of the waves, because it was all, or 90% of it was preventable, right? And I'm rounding on people who had months to do the right thing and didn't do the right thing, and then got extremely sick. And many of them realized that. Many of them realized that they hadn't thought it through the right way. And some of them even offered to help us vaccinate their communities if they were leaving the hospital.
That's something.
Yeah. So it was not all gloom and doom, but there was an element of resentment and paranoia as well, where the denial was just so thick. And we had people, demanding irrational treatments and, recording us and calling their lawyers and stuff like that. People were behaving very crazy. And, some of this, I think, is just the result of having been through the pandemic for 18 months now. I mean, we're all sick of this. But this was a remarkable own goal, is the best way I can describe it. I mean, this was a big human disaster, and it had a major impact on vaccinated patients who were not COVID patients, because we couldn't really do anything for a month other than deal with its wave. At the peak in our rural hospital, I'm now on the Big Island. At our peak, we had half of our beds filled with, I remember the peak day, I looked at the census, half of our beds were COVID, and our entire ICU was COVID, and all of those people, every single one of them was unvaccinated. And it just blew my mind that my community here would inflict that level of suffering on each other for no good reason. And my sympathy for it really ran out very quickly. I'm now at the point where I think we just need to do whatever we need to do to get this community as vaccinated as possible. Measles, if the vaccine rate falls much below 90%, outbreaks. And I think that's kind of where we're at here too.